A lot of people ask us, like, what does it mean to be an ambassador around human trafficking? Most of the ambassadors in the United States are ambassadors in residence. So it's an ambassador to another country, and you represent anything that comes up with the United States about that specific country. In addition to our ambassadors in residence, the United States has 6 ambassadors at large. So not an ambassador to one place, but to everywhere, but only on one specific topic. And in the year 2000, Congress elevated the issue of trafficking in persons to having an ambassador at large. And I'm really grateful that they did, because it allows us to dig into this issue in a new and important way. Here's what I want to do. I want to talk to you guys for a few minutes about the problem that exists, the trends that are happening, and why there's hope. Because I think this could be a pretty heavy topic. It could be a topic that could make us think there's not much that we can do. And it's actually something that is completely preventable. We just got a new number from the International Labor Organization last September, estimating that there's 27.6 million victims of human trafficking in the world today. That's more people that are being currently trafficked than ever before in human history. More people than were trafficked during the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. Most of them are in the developing world. We think half of them might actually be in India. The largest concentration is in China. And it's something that we have to deal with. It is a massive problem. It's brutal. And there's something we can do about it. But how do we define it? Like, what is human trafficking? If you ask your neighbors, you're going to hear lots of different answers. If you go to Google and search news on human trafficking, half the inquiries that come up are not going to have anything to do with human trafficking. They're going to talk about other things. But human trafficking at its core is just compelling someone to work or compelling someone to engage in a commercial sex act. And all of it's focused on the idea of compelling. It's not about movement. It's not about crossing a border. It's about taking away someone's freedom to decide where they work, who touches their bodies, and when they wake up in the morning. And it is an economically motivated crime. It always has been from the very beginning. Traffickers do not wake up thinking about, how do I abridge someone's fundamental human rights? They think about, how do I make my money? Whether it was plantation owners in Virginia in the 1800s, it was all about making money. Or whether it was the Arabian slave trade, whether it was what was happening in China, in India, Incas, and Mayans, it's always been about money. How much? $150.2 billion a year is what the UN estimates what traffickers make. That's a lot of money. But I don't know about you all, but my family budget doesn't work in billions. And so I was trying to get my arms around how much $150 billion a year is. Get this, it's more than Microsoft, Starbucks, Target, BP, and Exxon combined in gross revenues. Trafficking is big business. Now, when you all look at trafficking issues or you hear about it, you're going to hear all sorts of different terms. And the term human trafficking or trafficking in persons is not a defined term in law. Underneath that umbrella term, we might find involuntary servitude, slavery, peonage, sex trafficking, all sorts of different terms. But we're used to category terms like cancer. Like, no one actually gets cancer. You get melanoma, you get lymphoma, you get different types of things that are in the category of cancer. They have different tests to diagnose them. They have different treatment plans. But we need a category term to talk about cancers in general. So there's lots of different individual offenses that are a part of human trafficking, but trafficking is our category term. At the heart, all of this comes down to human dignity. The only reason that trafficking is wrong is because everyone has inherent value, and they always have, right? So for most of human history, trafficking has been legally adopted, it's been religiously condoned, it's been culturally accepted, but it's always been wrong. It wasn't democracies that convinced us that trafficking was wrong, because for years, democracies embraced trafficking. It's in our Constitution in 3 places, shamefully. But it's this idea of human dignity that separates us and gives us the hope that something can change. Human dignity itself, this idea that everyone has inherent value, changes how we view issues. So if you're from a faith perspective, it might be this idea of Imago Dei, the image of God in every single person. If you're not from a faith perspective, it might be something like the International Declaration of Human Rights that says that everyone has inherent value, rights that governments do not grant and which governments should not interfere with. It's this idea that allows us to defeat racism and gender-based violence and every other challenge we have. So I thought I'd just give you guys a couple trends, 5 in fact, 5 trends that are happening right now in the anti-trafficking space from around the world. And you'll hear more local issues after I finally sit down. So one is, people act like identifying victims is finding a needle in a haystack. This idea that it's so hard to figure out where trafficking is occurring. Well, the numbers support this haystack deception. Last year, governments around the world reported identifying 90,354 victims out of the 27.6 million that are estimated to exist, which means that we are identifying less than half of 1% of all the victims that we think exist. That is shameful. Every country in the world now has a law against trafficking, and we're identifying less than half of 1% of all the victims. That's an F. I got 2 kids in college right now. If they got half of 1% of all the questions right on their test, the only reason they would get an F is because there's not a lower grade to give. Now, I love my friends in the U.S. government and around the world and my friends at the UN, but I think we need to be honest that we are not delivering right now on the protections that the law states we should. One survivor who's a friend of mine posted this picture, and she said, honestly, victims are just hiding in plain sight. They're right there, and we're just not noticing them. It's an evocative picture. It's his image that helps me appreciate the fact that maybe I need to look beyond the obvious and see what is there. And so there's lots of ways to identify victims. 80% of all victims that we've found say that they came in contact with healthcare providers while they were being victimized, while traffickers were exploiting them. What if we helped healthcare providers, nurses, doctors, ER folks, help them figure out what to look for? Educators, specialized units of investigators and prosecutors, faith communities, thoughtful prosecutors that were looking beyond the fact there was an offense before them. Just because someone might be trespassing in the middle of the night at a Walmart in Minnesota in December with no jacket and no shoes, they may very well be trespassing, but they also might be running away from something. What if we ask the next question? Could social workers help us in that? Okay, another trend. I want to pull back the curtain of what's actually going on with the government. Every year, the State Department publishes a trafficking in persons report. The most reliable report, and I don't say that just because I got to lead the office that published this for many years at the State Department. I was a consumer of this report long before I got to be an author. I want to draw your attention to these numbers. These are the numbers of global prosecutions. Since 2015, we have seen a 45% decrease in global prosecutions of traffickers all over the world. That is a stunning collapse of enforcement. And so what happens when we don't hold people accountable for a category of crime? That category of crime increases. Imagine what would happen if there were a rash of burglaries in your neighborhood and the police department decided, we're just not going to spend any time there. Or worse, if we catch the burglars, we're going to let them go. They get a get out of jail free card. Stunningly, these countries are giving a majority of traffickers that are convicted a suspended sentence. They're letting them go without any offense at all. So in Latvia, 100% of convicted traffickers go home with no penalty at all. You might think, well, Latvia is really small, so is Luxembourg. 83% in Chile? Japan, 80% of convicted traffickers walk out the front door of the courthouse, walk past the victims who had to testify and endure cross-examination, and get no penalty at all. Germany, 72%. Switzerland, 60%. Traffickers are operating with impunity. I've run the numbers. Get this, I kid you not. You are more likely to get struck by lightning than prosecuted for openly owning a modern day slave. And how worried are we about getting struck by lightning? Even this summer, when we have our thunderstorm every evening right here in Virginia, right? How worried am I? Not at all. It never crosses my mind. And I've talked to so many traffickers that I've gotten to know. They all tell me the same thing. They never worried about getting arrested. But you know who does? The trafficking victims. They constantly worry about getting arrested because you're more likely to get arrested as a victim of human trafficking than as a trafficker. We constantly, in the United States and around the world, are arresting the victims and seeing them as the criminal, even though the trafficker is the one that is causing them, directing them, requiring them to engage in the unlawful conduct. And they have no choice. And so I think we need to make good on our promise within our law that we're not going to penalize victims for the unlawful things their traffickers require them to do. We've got a huge problem when it comes to prosecution. We're prosecuting the wrong people, and we're not prosecuting the right people. Okay, here's a third trend that we're seeing. There's been a burden shifting in the law. Human rights activists have gotten frustrated with the failure of governments to do their job. And so they said, you know what? We want to shift the burden from the collapsed public justice system to businesses, and we want to hold the businesses accountable. And boardrooms are responding around the country. You all may be in them. You may be wondering what is happening with the new requirements around ESG or the new requirements around the due diligence laws in Europe. A lot of it centers for the United States around what's happening in Xinjiang, China. You may be aware that there is a genocide happening there, and that the government of China is forcing millions of Uyghur people, this Muslim minority that used to be called East Turkestan, but now it's called Xinjiang, forcing them to work. They're also committing a ton of other human rights abuses against them. Forced sterilization, all sorts of things. To the point where Secretary Pompeo led the State Department to declare what's happening there a genocide right before he left office. Guess what Secretary Blinken did 6 weeks later when he came into office? He affirmed it was a genocide. These two guys could not agree that the grass is green. And they agree that there is a genocide happening in Xinjiang. And they agree part of that is the forced labor. That means the tomato paste that Heinz Ketchup is importing is made with forced labor. It means every Tesla car that is produced at the factories in Xinjiang is made with forced labor. It means all the solar panels that we're trying to import right now, and the solar wafers and the polysilica are made with forced labor. We have an economy now dependent around the world on forced labor. And if you think it's just China, it's not. It's all the chocolate you consume. It's the battery that powers every one of your phones and every medical device that's keeping people alive in the hospitals around this town. Every single one of those lithium-ion batteries is sourced with cobalt from the DRC, and it's all made with forced labor. How do we reckon with an economy that's based on forced labor? How do we move away from that? And are we willing to pay the cost of that friction that would undoubtedly come? I don't say that to guilt you. Not at all. I have an iPhone, right? I can't afford a Tesla, but I have an iPhone. Like, my mom was in the hospital. She was on a machine that was powered by a battery that had cobalt in it. Like, you should use those devices. I'm not against it. I'm a part of this too. But we do need to recognize, are we complicit in some way? How could we help companies move beyond this? So one way is we've moved towards disclosure laws. California, the UK, and Australia led the way in saying companies of a certain size have to disclose what, if anything, they're doing to keep forced labor out of their economy. And now we're moving from the murky waters of disclosure requirements to the firm land of due diligence. And now Germany led with a law that just took effect that says that every company is going to be responsible for all of its direct suppliers, so think first level of your supply chain, for anything they've done wrong on human rights. That's vicarious liability. That's pretty bold. But guess what? The EU is about to pass a law this year to say it goes all the way down to the raw materials. You might think that's crazy. Say you want to sell t-shirts in Northern Virginia, and now all of a sudden you're responsible if the cotton fiber in your t-shirt that was grown in Turkmenistan and woven into yarn in Bangladesh and manufactured and loomed into fabric and then sewn in another country all of a sudden gets here and you're responsible? How could you as a t-shirt seller in this area ever know? And the EU says, we don't care. Their argument is that, you know what? Companies have been benefiting off the profits from exploitative labor for centuries. If anyone can bear the burden, they can. Other people are saying this is completely unfair to companies. It's a complete change to how we've always thought about vicarious liability, and there's no way that we can break the backs of the economy in order to do this. That would actually hurt the poor and vulnerable even more. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a thing. It's happening. If it hasn't affected your company, I think it will soon. So you might want to think about how to deal with it. Supply chains are being disrupted. And now all these new testing scores are coming in. People wanting to say, hey, we'll come in and we'll give you a score. We'll help you determine what's going to happen. I can tell you there's no industry standard yet. A lot of these companies seem fly by night. Some of them are good. All of them seem well-intentioned. But what do we do? How do you effectively plan your project, your company for the next several years? There's a lot of questions. Okay, a fourth issue that's coming up is the interconnected tangle of all the things that trafficking touches. Trafficking affects immigration, which brings up lots of passionate thoughts. It affects refugees and migrants. It affects vulnerable populations. It affects foster care. It affects poverty. It affects so many diverse issues that they all just feel tangled. And if we're going to be effective, we have to be focused. That is, we have to focus in on the next achievable thing we can do. Like, many movements are out there, but if you're going to be effective, you got to find the next achievable focus. So one great example is the women's rights movement. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of things adversely affected women. They couldn't effectively own property. They weren't allowed to go to school. There was no equitable distribution if they were divorced. They had no right to sue for divorce on their own. All sorts of challenges. You know what they chose? Voting. If they had polled women around the United States, like, what is the thing that's inconveniencing your life the most? I'm pretty sure voting would not have been it. But they realized if we choose voting, if we can win on voting, we can win on the next thing. And that was their next achievable focus. And so we had groups that disagreed with each other. There were the groups led by Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton, all these other groups that wanted, like, let's go district by district, state by state. And then there were these other folks that, like, chain ourselves to the White House gates and go on hunger strikes. They hated each other. They truly did. Read A Woman's Hour by Eleanor Weiss about the 19th Amendment and the battle for that. They really disagreed about tactics. But you know what they agreed about? Let's get the 19th Amendment. And they did. They came together. And so I just wonder, could we have a next achievable focus, even if it doesn't fix everything? And they knew voting wouldn't fix everything. They didn't even address the right of women of color to vote, even though Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth were standing right beside them, cheering them on, because they knew we needed a next step towards inevitable progress. So we have a paradox. We have a paradox of vulnerability in the anti-trafficking space. Here's the paradox. Vulnerabilities exist, but they don't cause trafficking. So you think about all the vulnerabilities out there: poverty, discrimination, migration, refugee status, disabilities, people who grow up in terrible families. Because for so many people, honestly, families are just not safe. A third of all the trafficking victims identified in the United States are trafficked by their family members. It stuns people all the time. And the number one relationship of family members is mother to daughter. Moms trafficking their daughters. A lack of education, a lack of credit, unemployment, all these things are vulnerabilities. But the vulnerabilities don't cause trafficking. But here's the thing. The traffickers target the vulnerabilities. That's the paradox, right? So right now we have 685 million people in extreme poverty in the world. That's a lot of people. But we only have 27 million that are trafficked. If poverty caused trafficking, we'd have a lot more trafficking victims. We've got 84 million refugees and displaced people, but only 27 million trafficking victims. If all the trafficking victims were refugees, it still only represents 31% of refugees. I say that because if we take our limited money for trafficking and start working on refugee issues, we miss our opportunity. The United States government programs out $3 billion a year for trafficking victims. It programs out less than $300 million for human trafficking. Think about that. More than $3 billion for refugees and less than $300 million for trafficking victims. And so don't be confused. I'm not asking for less money for refugees. I'm saying let's right-size the movement to fight human trafficking. Right now, we're just unfocused. And when you're unfocused, I think you're not going to have as big an impact as you should. So unfocused that, get this, when that 27.6 million number came out from the ILO last year, they also offered recommendations for what can be done to fight human trafficking. You want to know what their number one recommendation was? I kid you not. It was to improve workers' collective bargaining rights. Now, I've met survivors from all over the world. I've never met a survivor that said, you know what I really needed? I needed my labor lawyers to negotiate with their labor lawyers about when they would abuse me. Not once. And I'm not against unions. Like, if you like unions, great. Like, workers should be able to bargain. I had no dog in that fight. But as a targeted recommendation to fight an acute problem, that would be sort of like walking into the ER with a gunshot wound and having the doctor say, you really should eat better and exercise more as a way to be healthy. I'm like, yes, you're right. I should eat better and exercise more, but I have a bullet. Like, could you take the bullet out? My only hope to exercise and eat better is to live through the bullet wound I have. I think what we have here is the difference between root causes, which is trendy to talk about, and what's really just root correlations. There's a correlation between vulnerability and trafficking, but not a causal piece. What's causing trafficking are the individuals that are actually choosing to commit the crime. And at some point, we have to address them. All right, one last trend, and then I'm going to let you enjoy your food. Last trend is about kids. And it's been happening in the last 8 weeks. This is stunning. And I'm not suggesting it's right or wrong, but I'd love for you to know about it, and you guys can decide what's going on. We just got a new statement of principles from the United Nations that changes the way we protect kids from sexuality. So in the United States and in most governments, we say people under 18 cannot consent to sexual activity as a way to protect them from predators. The UN just published this. Sexual conduct involving persons below the domestically prescribed minimum age of consent to sex may be consensual in fact, if not in law. Basically saying that somehow a kid can factually consent to sex with an adult, even if the law prohibits it. A step away from where we've been. You may think, okay, that's just crazy people in Europe. That's not what's happening here. Check out this law in Minnesota. I kid you not. So Minnesota's had a human rights statute that has protected sexual orientation. Great. They say sexual orientation cannot be interfered with. Their law has always said that if you're a pedophile, that doesn't count. They've decided to advance a law to remove that. They want to remove this language. Sexual orientation does not include physical or sexual attachment to children by an adult. They want to strike that from their human rights statute, which would say that kids who have a sexual attraction or attachment to an adult gets all the human rights protection of sexual orientation. I don't know if this is going to pass or not, but man, it seems like a trend. Like, we're saying that like 15-year-olds and 40-year-olds are going to be able to have a human rights protected sexual relationship. I don't know, maybe it's just that I'm a father of kids, right? I just don't know how this operates. I don't know how you feel about it. Maybe this is the way you think our culture should go, but you should at least be aware of it. Subtly, slowly, this is happening over and over again throughout. Okay, but I want to leave you with one last thought about hope. There's so many reasons for hope in this space. There's hope because we know that trafficking is a man-made problem. It's not inevitable. It's not a naturally occurring phenomenon. We can do something to stop it. But one thing we can do to stop it is for groups like Rotary to be engaged. You know, Rotary has been involved in so many issues around the world, most notably polio. You guys get to actually take credit for being one of the major forces in eradicating polio around the world. Yeah, it's really impressive. You really do. But why live in the past? What if you guys became a major force in eradicating modern day slavery around the world?